Hello and welcome. I'm so excited to be here with you today to talk about communicating with young minds. And I first want to give thanks to my partners who have helped me sponsor this event, Frontiers for Young Minds. I am a huge fan of your work and excited about our journey together. For those of you who are viewing in through YouTube, anytime during my talk you have a question, go ahead and enter it in the chat window. We're monitoring all the questions. And if you see a question that you really like, go ahead and vote it up because we'll order the questions according to their popularity. And I also want to thank the Gewurz Graduate School of Education here at the University of California at Santa Barbara, who has been a really big supporter of the development of my work in community-based literacies. And so without further ado, I want you to just imagine that you're picturing a scene that involves a child and adult. Just think of what you would imagine would be the most common kind of interaction between that child and that adult. And you may conjure up various scenarios, various scenes. One might be a grocery store where a parent is shopping with their child. Another one might be a classroom where a teacher is with a student. Or you might be out on an athletic field and a coach is speaking with one of his or her young athletes. In each of these scenarios, invariably learning is involved, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And in fact, we've been having a conversation about the different kinds of ways that we foster learning environments. And this has been an increasingly hot topic, especially in educational research. And there was a conversation about a year ago about these two different approaches in fostering learning with young minds. And one approach was characterized as a gardener. The idea that the adult is this gardener that is looking at all the varieties of plants and species within a particular space, trying to think about what ingredients would help foster learning in the best ways. And then there was another approach that was sort of compared or contrasted with that approach of the gardener, that of the carpenter. The idea that, really specific coaching to help hone skills that would help the child gain expertise. So a good example of a gardener might be a teacher fostering various interests within their classrooms. And a good example of a carpenter might be an Olympic coach, right, in trying to foster a sense of excellence. And there was also a conversation that sometimes we engage in both of these approaches, depending on the needs and the context of that learning environment. But I want for you to consider a different approach, a different picture altogether. And I'm getting help from this magnificent ancient oak tree that is just outside my house. I love this tree. I feel like this tree understands me. And what's interesting is we're coming to know a lot more about trees in recent years. We actually know that they communicate. And not only do they communicate, but they communicate across species of trees. And not necessarily in competitive ways, but also in collaborative ways. This ancient oak has seen fires, mudslides, floods, droughts. It's seen a lot of species of birds flying in and out, lots of wisdom. But it still wants to grow. It wants to learn and knows that history is only part of the picture. As conditions continue to change and grow and evolve over time, the tree needs to grow and evolve over time. And that the tree knows that good information comes from everywhere. The difference between the wisdom of this tree And we do know that some of these old trees act like sort of nurturing hubs for other parts of the region. The difference between this tree and the pictures I showed you beforehand is that unlike the gardener and the carpenter, the tree is immersed in the learning environment. It is part of the learning environment. It is not outside observing and trying to affect certain learning happening among the students. But that does happen. I know many teachers that see themselves as part of the learning process. But the analogies don't allow full visibility of how much we can be co-learners. And so in communicating with young minds, I'm going to take this notion of co-learner from this sort of example of this tree and explore it with you today. So this is a picture of what a typical classroom looked like back at the turn of the century. Rigid rows of wooden desks, little holes in front for ink wells, not a lot of movement. So the expectations are that students face forward, the teacher's desk is here up on the front, and the idea is that you are absorbing or receiving important knowledge. Modern classrooms look extremely different now. A lot of modular furniture allows for different configurations of group-like settings. There's a lot of technologies being integrated in that space for a variety of movements. But there is one aspect of classroom discussions in this learning environment that those of us in literacy research have noticed that still remain. There tends to be a dominant discourse within a classroom setting that goes a little bit like this. What is X? Why is X important? And how is this applied, or how do we use this within various settings? Such questions are indeed important. Teachers need to understand what children are understanding about really important conceptual information. So trying to check that understanding is really important. However, when it happens a lot, you'll see a dynamic change in the classroom. We call these questions, they kind of fall into a general category of questions that first begin with a bit of inquiry that is invariably from the teacher, followed by a response from one or more students, and then follows up and finishes up with an evaluation. So if I were to ask, what is 4 plus 4? A student might say 8, and I say, very good, and I move on. So once we get into this pattern, it can be difficult to get out. And when this dominates a learning environment, what happens is the tension in the classroom tends to rise. You can feel it, even when the responses from the students are absolutely correct. And I would even say especially when, because that student doesn't want to give the wrong answer. And if, as adults, if you've ever been in a high-powered situation where there's this speaker with incredible knowledge and expertise, and they ask a question to the audience, you can feel it amongst ourselves. Even if we're pretty sure what the answer is, we tend to get intimidated about producing that answer because of the evaluation. It's an assessment. So how do we break that pattern up and integrate it in ways that doesn't increase the anxiety among young minds? Well, it sort of starts from this question that I have here. What exactly do you want to learn from young minds? What do you hope to learn? And even before that, what are your assumptions of what you can learn from children? Those assumptions are important because they set the tone for how much you bring into that learning environment. So for example, and I want to talk about this idea that children may actually have what we call funds of knowledge that they would share, that they could share within a learning environment. And when I say funds of knowledge, I mean the knowledge, the experiences, the histories. There are many things that children come into a learning environment knowing. And oftentimes we don't get a chance to express that. This picture here is of me. I'm in the center holding my new baby brother. I'm 6 years old. It is several decades ago. And my father and my mother are flanking me, and it's an idyllic time. My father immigrated from Iran many, many, many moons ago, and was an economics professor. What my first grade teacher didn't know about me is that I knew the term opportunity cost. Why? Because when I asked whether I could have a certain toy or a certain kind of product, my father would engage in a conversation that to buy that particular product would mean that maybe I wouldn't be able to do something else later. So I learned the concept at a very young age. That knowledge never had a chance to thrive in my classroom because there wasn't a space for it. And so I began to wonder when I was older, what would happen if children had a chance to share? And I have a real story to share about that. As a 7th grade science teacher, before I became a professor, I loved talking about the brain with my kids. The kids were so excited about this wonderful thing that's above our necks, and the wondrous connections and the dynamic constellations of thought that is produced among our synaptic connections. And one popular book was this book here about Phineas Gage, who was one of the first studies of the brain in the Western world, at least. And this is about a foreman back on the railroads long time ago, late 1700s, I believe, and had an accident with a tamping iron. And it shot up right through his skull, and he lived to tell about it. And he actually survived for several years after. And as I'm reading this story, the children are riveted. And then a question: what is a tamping iron? I was so focused on the brain and the skull and all of the wondrous conceptual information that was in this book, I hadn't thought about wondering what a tamping iron was. And I didn't know the answer, and I was a little nervous because even though I know that teachers don't have to know everything, there is still this feeling like I should know that. So I stopped, I paused, and I said these small words: I don't know. Does anyone know? And sure enough, one of my students knew. Oh yeah, my great-grandfather worked on the railroad. I know what a tamping iron is. And he went up to the board and drew it out, talked about how it was used. It was phenomenal, the details that he shared. What's fascinating about this is that James was in special education and was viewed by many students as someone who wasn't considered to be that smart because of his special classes that he would take. That completely changed after this discussion. He became one valued contributor in our conversations. So this is one example what can happen when we give the space for kids to share their funds of knowledge. So I had to position, or I started to see myself as a co-learner. And I wanted to foster that relationship. And there's really 3 ingredients. And the first one is what I've been saying, is to create a listening space. So many of us want so much to share. We have so much to share. But it's even more rewarding to see how our sharing can connect and build on the ideas and the thoughts of children. Another ingredient is inviting the notion of disagreement and critique during these discussions. And the third is engaging community-based literacies, the idea that we're learning together and that we are members of a given community, communicating among each other. And when I use that word literacies, what I mean are all the varying ways in which we communicate with one another in order to grow and understand and thrive in society. So this is the reading, the writing, the listening, speaking, doing, being in a particular discipline for a particular purpose under certain conditions and within a particular time frame. All of those contextual factors help define a community space. And I will talk about each of these in turn. So first, talking about creating a listening space. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with this, the man in this photo, but he is very popular, especially among people my age and older. The man in the picture is Fred Rogers, Mr. Fred Rogers, and he is the creator of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which was a very popular children's television show on our public broadcasting system. And this show, even though it was just sort of displayed to me, you know, I couldn't speak back to Mr. Rogers. Somehow I felt like he listened. There was a lot of quiet moments during the show. A lovely jazz-like thematic background because he was a musician. So many things about that show, the important themes that he carried through. It was all founded on the idea that children have foundational, very important and poignant ways of thinking and feeling that should be taken seriously. And he integrated that into his show. And if you ever have a chance to watch the documentary, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, oh, actually it's titled Won't You Be My Neighbor? I would highly recommend it. In that documentary, there's some footage from the 60s, I believe, where he speaks about a time where he walked into a young elementary classroom. And the first thing he did is he just sort of stood there and looked and gazed upon the young minds that were in front of him. And immediately a child interjected, "My doggy's ear came off in the automatic washer." And then there was silence. And it was almost as if, he said, that they were giving him a test. "This is your test, Mr. Rogers. Are you still in touch with childhood?" And so he could have responded in so many different ways, right, as adults will, especially if they think about wanting to foster the learning among those young minds. And what he said was, that happens. That happens to toys a lot, but it doesn't happen to us. Our noses don't fall off, our ears don't fall off. And immediately the children started to build on what he's saying. One kid said, "And our legs don't fall off?" And he goes, "No, it doesn't." And then something switched among the kids. They started to ask these incredible questions. And Mr. Rogers said it was almost as if that he passed a test and they opened the door and said, "You are welcome in. And we can trust you with our deepest and darkest thoughts and feelings and the like." So in creating a listening space, for many of us, it's very difficult to have wait time. Especially when I'm up here speaking to a camera. But it's worth it. It's absolutely worth doing. Because in those spaces of waiting, we give the green light for others to initiate, and we position ourselves as co-learners. And there's so much we want to share, and I have to say I haven't met a more passionate learner than a biologist. I love how excited they get when they talk about the phenomena. But think about it in the way that Mr. Rogers thought about it. He didn't try to correct the child, saying, "Are you sure it was your doggy that got whose ears came off? I think it was something else." He didn't try to improve or try to correct him in any way. Instead, he chose to build on the child's interjections. And so if we think about waiting, the wait time, and just leaning into that silence, and then think about ways of building on children's suppositions and ideas, we will be far more successful in creating that co-learning environment that will be exciting for everyone, including adults who need to thrive and grow as well. As a classroom teacher, having disagreements among students was not always a comfortable experience for me. And I think it's because I had the assumption that learning should be pleasant. You should have your epiphanies and build on each other's ideas. We don't want any conflicts. But when you look into the professional world and think about you as professionals, how often you are struggling with ideas, maybe even competing and arguing with evidence-based reasoning, it's not so much trying to find the right answer as much as it is trying to find a better answer. And as scientists, those of you who are scientists like myself, I'm a social scientist, I know that we want to constantly be focused on finding better answers about the natural world and the people living in it. And so it makes more sense if we're wanting to foster post-secondary readiness among young minds that they get a chance to practice that kind of argumentation as well. So to not only live in that tension, but to foster it in ways that allow students to also relax and see this as a natural part of growing and thriving together. So that is those areas, those two pieces, the listening and the inviting of critique and argumentation, are a big part of the framework I've developed here called community-based literacies. And there are fundamental principles that support my framework. First of all, any child that is who lives or lives within our area is welcome to attend our reading clinic that we have housed in the Gewurz Graduate School of Education. I am faculty director of the McEnroe Reading and Language Arts Clinic there, and children from all over the area come to work on their literacy skills and reading, writing, listening, speaking, and the like. And they know our principles quite well because we review them together as a community. We are a community. We learn from each other, and we also listen to each other. We work together, and we help each other, and we give each other space to think. And that one's a little tough because there is an impulse to correct, and that's something that we work on in the clinic, is giving people a chance to grapple, whether it's with a text or a question. We want everyone to have that space that they need to think so that they could contribute in important ways. We give each other a chance to share, and we respect each other. So with these principles, these are the grounding principles from which we engage in our work together, in our collaborations together as co-learners. And one important way in which we collaborate is through understanding various forms of academic texts that can be very challenging for children. And this is a picture of a group of children working through data representations. Visual representations are becoming increasingly more prevalent And they're an important part of many scientific studies, especially those of you who are tuning in. You would be integrating visual representations into your work as you produce them for children. And we're engaged in a multi-year study to unpack how a child comes to develop an understanding of unpacking and critically analyzing texts. What we've noticed, or what is also a huge concern among literacy researchers and scholars, is that in this era of such enormous amounts of information coming from all directions, and some being more truthful than others, we have noticed, and it is definitely signaled within the next generation science standards, that we must be focused on raising critical consumers of text. And the way that we engage that in our community-based literacies approach is forming small collaborative groups so that children have time and space to think and share and contribute to unpack what they see in such representations. And the ways in which we do that is through a questioning tool. What do you see? We start very simply. What do you see? What do you notice? What do you think is most important? We know that there are many texts out there designed for very specific purposes, but we also know that they're being brought into a context of learning, of a learning environment that may be focused on a similar or maybe slightly different purpose. And so we open that idea of interpretation and application to our students. What do you think is most interesting? What is confusing for you? What clues are in the text that help us unpack? So we're very interested in fostering the kinds of skills and abilities for kids to be able to take those with them when there isn't adult in the room, so they know what they can do to unpack any text that might be confusing. What have we learned so far? Does everyone agree? In that way, we invite disagreement, right? So that we can get better answers and become and foster that sense of critical consumership. But I think one of the most important questions that all of our instructors focus on is what is missing in the text? What questions or advice do you have for the author? And those questions are quite new in the area of literacy teaching and learning. Because the assumptions before, and if you look back in the day, especially in the 80s, the idea is that there's this correct answer that you have to dig out of the text. This idea that there is a main idea, there's a main point, and I need to get at that point. Now we've come to see the text as just one of many co-learners. If you're anything like me, I don't like to look at any of my past publications because I'm invariably going to find something I wish I had rewritten, you know, or restated in a different way. I might even see a typo that the copyright editor missed, right? So, I am very much aware of the fact that there's no perfect text out there. But that's the beauty of textual explorations, is if we position them as co-learners with children, then opens a whole new world of thinking and being that isn't full of tension of trying to figure out the answer, but many possible answers. And also to be able to see through multiple exposures, through many different texts, developing a sense of what would be an ideal text for a given time under given conditions. So this is the model that we have for community-based literacies. And that positions every instructor in our clinic and also in the programs that we oversee as co-learners. And I just want to circle back to the wise tree. So this beautiful tree, full of wisdom, is also wanting to know even more. This tree, if it had a chance to talk to us, might say something like, position yourself as co-learner when you're with a young person. Allow their ideas to surface into the space. Build on that. Collaborate with that. And then see how learning is fundamentally wonderful for all of you. So I want to thank you for giving me your time and attention. And now I am prepared to take any questions from this audience and also the audience on the web. Yes?
I'm a graduate student and in education. I'm very happy to see there's an emerging understanding of the inquiry response evaluation format that's so typical in classrooms. And I have a question for you, which is, to what extent do you keep that in addition to more progressive educational techniques or projects, I should say?
Well, it's inevitable, right? It's inevitable in the sense that it's so important that that we check understanding. And so just to restate the question that a graduate student said here in the audience is, you know, we have that IRE, the inquiry response evaluation pattern. How do we hold that in check in our discourse with young students? And I would say, I think the most important thing is how you begin. And it's absolutely fine to integrate the IRE once the children's questions are being asked. And there's a way of asking that maybe could be more framed as, okay, well, before I begin, I want to learn. Maybe even say, I would like to learn what your thoughts are about X. So notice that I don't say, so tell me exactly what blank is. I'm saying, oh, before we begin, maybe I need to learn something, I think, about what you think about that. What are your thinking? You know, what's your thinking? So hedging a little bit, softening the question can help as well. And it's hard for me to think of multiple different strategies. But I think 2 ingredients, you can keep it really simple. Try not to start with an IRE question because it'll be hard to bring in that space for children's thoughts and ideas. And then I would build on it and maybe embed it within the discussion once it gets going through an idea of you wanting to learn. Is there questions from the web? No? No questions from the web. Well, wonderful.
I had a question.
Oh, you do? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So I feel like especially with older students, such as undergraduates, they've been in the public schooling system so long that is used to having a teacher in the more conventional role, someone who is more of an authority on everything and should have all the answers. So if students are coming in with that expectation that the teacher should be the authority and not necessarily a co-learner, how do you help, I guess, try to reframe that if they're have strong expectations of their own?
So what's interesting is when I started to position myself as a co-learner with my middle school students, who invariably you could imagine that the IRE pattern starts in kindergarten. I mean, what color is this? Great, good job. What sound does the letter B make? Oh, very good. So that it starts very early. I would even say preschool. There was no resistance. It was fascinating. I would say the only resistance I got from students in middle school and a little bit in high school are the kinds of questions that they would ask afterwards. So, is this right? The kind of is this right question. And so what I have done is flip that question on its head, and we'll look at, let's say if it's a piece of writing, did I do this right? You know, Ms. Arya, did I do this right? And I would say, well, let's look at this together. Let's see. What was the goal again? And then all of a sudden they forget that they're wanting the answer from me and they're trying to help me. They're like, oh, this is that activity that we're supposed to do, and this. I'm like, oh, and then what? Okay, so then if that's the goal of the activity, then this writing was for, and then all of a sudden the child is no longer interested in what I'm thinking. They're actually thinking about the text and kind of co-teaching with me. So I sort of foster a kind of a learning environment in that way. Any other questions? Well, I enjoyed my time here, and I look forward to next week. Next week, we're going to dig deeper, especially into this particular model, this questioning model that I let you know, and really dig into these kinds of texts. What makes a quality text that fosters a sense of consumership, critical consumership, and engagement and learning among young minds. So the next segment will be on writing for young minds. All right. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again.